I ran out of incense, but that just means it's time to make more. As a witch, it's really easy to put a lot of energy into hand making your incense, but sometimes the end result just stinks. No, seriously, like it stinks. I'm going to walk you through my incense making process, give you some tips on making better incense, as well as some of the top things to avoid so that your incense doesn't suck. But first, I want to hear about your worst incense story. Have you ever accidentally fumigated a house? If so, tell me about it in the comments below. I'll tell you mine at the end of the video. Let's get started. Hey everybody, I'm Aerik Arkadian and this is my crash course on making incense. To start, let's play a little game. Which one is the mortar and which one is the pestle? I always mix that up. And there's a ton of different terms you're going to come across in the world of incense, like stick, cone, hand-rolled, combustible, non-combustible, loose, backflow, and I'm not going to get into any of that. I'm going to demonstrate my personal process, which is making pill incense. What is pill incense, you might ask? Well, it's incense shaped like a pill. Where does it come from, you might ask? Oh, I've got a book for that, actually.
No, not here. Ah, here it is.
We make a suffumigation, blah blah, in this manner, blah 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 blah, after the manner of pills. After the manner of pills. After the manner of pills. That was a tiny sentence from 3 books of occult philosophy by Agrippa. Basically, pill incense is when you take all of your dry ingredients, add some sort of binding agent, and then squish everything together. Before I show you how I do that, let me give you some quick tips. These should pretty much help you regardless of what type of incense you're making. Resin should be ground until it has the consistency of coarse sea salt. When you're grinding your resin, you can hold one hand over the mortar to stop little pieces from flying out. If your resin is particularly gummy, you can put it in the freezer overnight to help it harden up. Use high-quality ingredients. I once bought a cheap bulk bag of myrrh that ended up pretty much being a big bag of dirt. I actually have it here. Look at this. Where's the resin? It's like a big jar of dirt. Odd numbers of ingredients are nice and magical. 3, 5, 7, and 9 are good numbers to aim for, but it's not absolutely necessary. If possible, you may want to keep separate mortar and pestles, one for your resins and one for your dry plant materials, flowers, leaves, herbs, etc. You may also want to keep a third that you only use for baneful or poisonous herbs or other weird ingredients like bone. A nutmeg grater can come in handy if you're working with ingredients like hard woods or barks. Pay attention to top, middle, and base notes when you're crafting your blend. Top notes are things like lemon or pine that might give you a first impression of a scent. Middle notes could be things like cardamom or lavender that make up the body, and base notes could be things like sandalwood or vanilla that form an underlying aroma that ties everything together. Of course, if your ingredients are purely for magical purposes, you might be focused more on the correspondences than the aroma, and that's totally fine. Remember that things smell differently when they burn. A fresh rose does not smell the same as burning a dried rose petal. You can use electric herb grinders if you want, but here's why I stay away from them. Making incense, for me, is a magical process. When I grind the herbs by hand, I'm adding my energy to the mix. And if I'm using an electric herb grinder to do that work for me, I'm robbing the incense of the energy that is distinctly me. You know, this isn't a commercial product that I'm making. This is my recipe. It's my ritual incense. It's personal. So I want it to have every ounce of energy and intention that it can. Let me show you the recipe we're going to be working with today. 3 parts frankincense, 3 parts myrrh, 3 parts benzoin, 1 part dragon's blood, 2 parts lavender flower, 1 part rose petal, 1 part white willow bark, 1 pinch powdered cinnamon, 1 part sandalwood oil. You can use this recipe to make regular loose incense, or since it has oil as an ingredient, you can use that as a binder and make pill incense. Okay, I'm going to make myself smaller and I'm going to demonstrate for you. Here we go. I guess I will narrate while I'm down here. So I've got my mortar and my pestle set up, and I am using an espresso spoon as my parts measurement, just because that seems to work well for this recipe. I'm going to start out by adding my resins. This recipe calls for 3 parts frankincense, 3 parts myrrh, and 3 parts benzoin. So I am actually using scoops of 3 Kings resin here, which is equal parts all 3 of those resins. So total, I'm going to add 9 scoops. Okay, I think that was 9 anyway. I'm going to move on to my dragon's blood resin now. Recipe calls for 1 part. Kind of struggled to get a full scoop there, so go back for a little bit more. And hey, you know what? You can never have too much dragon's blood. Just a little bit more. I'm gonna start pounding the resin down, and I will cover the mortar with my hand to prevent little chips from flying out. What we're targeting here is the consistency of coarse sea salt. I'm gonna give it some grinds. I feel like it has been ground down to where it should be, so I'm gonna go ahead and take my resin and separate it. I will pour it into a little ramekin and set it aside so that I can come back to it later. Here's how much I have. That looks good to me. Next ingredient that I'm going to work on is my white willow bark. So I've begun working on my dried plant material now, and the reason I'm starting with the bark is because it is by far the hardest to grind down. So it'll continue getting ground as I add each additional ingredient on top of that. Looks like I've got it to a fairly reasonable consistency here. I'm going to add 2 parts of lavender. Looks good. Gonna grind this down. That looks good. Moving on to the next ingredient is 1 part rose. So I actually dry rose petals anytime we have roses around the house, and yeah, sure. This looks like 1 part to me. I'm gonna go ahead and grind those in there. Everything is looking good so far. I'm done with the dry ingredients, so I'm gonna go ahead and take those into their own separate ramekin. So now I can compare the size of my 2 piles, and I'm aiming to have at least a 50-50 mix between my resin and my dry ingredients. It looks like I definitely have that. So now that I'm sure I've got a good mix going, I'm gonna throw everything back into the mortar. And here comes my last dry ingredient, just a little pinch of powdered cinnamon. I like to add this at the end after I've recombined everything else. I'll give this a few passes with the pestle just to make sure that it's all good and mixed up. Looking good to me. And here comes my binding agent, which is sandalwood oil. I'm going to start with 10 to 15 drops spread all around the powder. You can see where they land They make little wet spots. I like to mix it around with the spoon first and kind of fold it over on top of itself so that the oil doesn't get stuck to the bottom of the mortar. After I've mixed it, it still looks too dry, so I'm going to add another 10 to 15 drops. Mix that around with the spoon again. And at this point, I might have enough oil, so I'm going to give it a grind. You can definitely see that the color of the mix has turned a lot darker brown. I'm scooping around the sides and the bottom to make sure that no small pieces of resin or parts of the oil are stuck to the bottom, but it still looks too dry to me, so I'm going to add another 10 to 15 drops of oil. And here I am pressing it around with the spoon again to give it a good mix. Now I'll do another few passes with the pestle. Now we're talking. This is the color that I'm looking for when I make this pill incense. And just to give it a final quality check, I'm going to scoop it up with the spoon and just kind of see how it behaves as I move it around in the mortar. Looks good to me. This next step isn't completely necessary, but I like to add it. The ingredients are not in their final state, but they're almost done. So I want to give it a bit of an energetic sonic cleansing, and I just use the singing bowl for that. I rang it and I played it over top of the ingredients. This is where I'm putting my intention in the mix just by holding my hands over all the ingredients. This is a ritual incense, so the intention that is going in this mix is for the flow of energy, open communication, good coven dynamics, etc., etc. I'm finally ready to start forming everything into incense pills. So I have my little rosin pre-press. I'm using a half tablespoon as my measurement so that I can keep all the pills to roughly the same size. Also, I found that if it's larger than this in my press, it doesn't work too well and the pill kind of falls apart. Now that I've loaded the cylinder, I'm going to start pressing. I like to squeeze it in there with my hands, and I am using a sledgehammer dampened by a folded paper towel just to make sure I really knock everything into place, and I'm going to give it quite a few good whacks. Squeezing it together just to make sure everything's good. I'm going to take off the end cap. Push my pill through, and on my press, the inner cylinder does not go all the way through, so I have to use a little wooden dowel very gently to press the pill out. There's my first pill. Looks pretty good to me. I'm going to set that plate aside and I'm going to repeat the process. Load up my press with a half tablespoon of the incense mix. Press and hammer everything down, really getting it secure and mashed. And popping out the pill with the wooden dowel. That looks great. Oh, this time I decided to show you what it looks like. Very nice. So I'm going to repeat this process a total of 7 times just because that happens to be what fits in my incense jar. And look at those. They look wonderful. So those pills remain pretty fragile until they dry for about a day. After a day of drying, they harden up and, they get really solid. The only thing that's left to do is to test one out. So I grab my handy dandy sensor, I pop a charcoal in, and we're going to get the charcoal started. I want to show you what it looks like when it actually burns, so I'm going to make sure that this charcoal is good and glowing before I throw the incense pill on. See a lot of gray around the edges, so we know the charcoal's going, and I'm going to throw the incense pill on. It fits perfectly right in the middle of the charcoal, and it's just going to take a second for the resin to start melting and for everything to start smoking up. Yeah, it's definitely going pretty good now. Kind of fun to watch it from above. Definitely getting cloudy in here. I'm going to take this and I'm going to put it over on the shelf. So we've got another view of the pill incense burning here in front of a couple goddess statues on one of our shelves. I find that these pills will usually burn for about 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how dry they are. So it's usually the perfect amount of time for a ritual incense. We usually use one pill, maybe two. Okay, and that's the whole process there. Hey, check that out. I'm stocked up again. Okay, here's the fun part. Things that will ruin your incense. Over grinding. If you completely pulverize your ingredients into a fine powder, it's going to hit the charcoal, smoke up, and then be done. Also, powdering a resin kind of destroys the natural aroma. You want your resin chunks to be big enough so that they can release their scent by melting. An incorrect ratio of resin and herbs. Grind your resin, set it aside, then grind your herbs and compare the size of that pile to your resin pile. Optimally, you want to have 50-50 or more in favor of resin. I personally find that a 60-40 mix produces a better burning incense. If you find you don't have enough resin at this point, it's okay to throw more in the mix and regrind. Overusing an ingredient. There are some spices, especially powdered ones, that can act as an irritant to the eyes, throat, and nose when burned. I'm talking about things like cinnamon and clove. These can easily overpower any other scent in the mix, so make sure you use them sparingly. Being too dry. A dry incense will burn too quickly and produce too much smoke. There are a number of interesting ways that you can wet your incense, including honey and fruit, but I personally prefer to use essential oils. If you're in a pinch, even a few drops of olive oil can make a big difference. Okay, so my worst incense experience. I was experimenting. I remember using a lot of powdered herbs like anise, cinnamon, and clove. And of course, I completely pulverized the resins down to a powder too. So I put a scoop on the charcoal and it smoked up the entire room. It was awful. I had to set the incense burner outside because it was so bad. I think we had to leave the windows open for about 3 days to get the smell out. I appreciate you watching this video. If you enjoyed these incense tips, please like and subscribe here on YouTube so that you're notified when I put out new content. If you'd like to help support me, you can check out my Patreon page in the video description below. And you can also follow me on Facebook at Aerik Arkadian. Remember, there's always a way to make music. Until next time.